picture this. You are standing in the vast, desolate expanse of the Australian outback.
It is completely pitch black.
Exactly. I mean, if you stand completely still, the loudest sound you can hear is your own heartbeat.
It's terrifying just to think about.
It really is. So it's the evening of July 14th, 2001. A young British couple, Peter Falconio and Joanne Lees, are driving their orange VW Combi van down the Stewart Highway.
And they are hundreds of kilometers from any major city.
Right. They are surrounded by a landscape that is roughly the size of Europe, and suddenly they get flagged down by a stranger in a white Toyota four-wheel drive.
The guy points to the back of their van and says he sees sparks.
Yeah. And what follows is a nightmare that gripped the entire world, and a mystery that, well, in some ways, continues to this very day.
It's a case that forces us to look at the absolute extremes of human survival, really.
And the absolute limits of forensic science.
Exactly, because the fundamental challenge here is prosecuting the ultimate crime without the ultimate piece of evidence.
Which is wild. You have to wonder how a case like that even goes to trial without a body. Let's go back to that freezing winter night on the Stewart Highway. Peter is driving. Joanne is in the passenger seat.
And this white Toyota just pulls up alongside them.
Yeah. The driver is wearing a black baseball cap, sporting a mustache, and he signals frantically that there are sparks shooting out of the Combi's exhaust. So Peter pulls over and gets out to investigate.
He asks Joanne to move into the driver's seat, right?
Right, to be ready to rev the engine so they can diagnose the problem. And as she's sitting there, waiting, she hears a loud bang from the back of the van.
And her initial reaction, which honestly makes complete sense in the context of engine trouble, is that the van simply backfired.
Of course. But that illusion shatters just moments later. The stranger suddenly appears at her window holding a silver handgun.
Oh, wow.
He climbs into the van, forces her hands behind her back, and violently binds them with black cable ties.
Just a completely escalating nightmare.
He tries to tape her mouth shut and bind her feet together. Then he physically drags her out of the Combi and forces her toward his four-wheel drive. And she notices something weird, a dog sitting in the front seat of his vehicle.
At this point, Lees is operating on pure adrenaline and terror. I mean, she anticipates being assaulted or killed, but she manages to seize on a momentary distraction. The attacker steps away from his vehicle, likely to deal with Peter Falconio's body, and Lees takes that tiny window of opportunity to escape.
She just dives into the pitch-black bushland.
Right into the scrub.
Just imagine the sheer terror of that scenario. It's the dead of an outback winter, which means it is freezing cold.
And her hands are tied behind her back.
Exactly. She's hiding in the scrub, and she can hear him actively hunting her. She watches the beam of his torch sweep through the darkness, listening to his footsteps as he walks past her hiding spot multiple times.
It's literal psychological torture.
It is. Eventually, after hours of this, he gives up and drives away. Sometime after midnight, she manages to stumble back out to the highway and flags down a massive road train.
And when law enforcement finally arrives, the situation immediately presents a unique and massive investigative nightmare.
Because there's no body.
What's fascinating here is that without a body, establishing the actual fact of death relies entirely on circumstantial evidence and forensics.
Right.
When they secure the scene, all they find is a dirt-covered pool of Falconio's blood on the highway, the abandoned Combi van hidden about 80 meters deep into the scrub, and some incredibly weak DNA traces.
There is no body and no murder weapon.
Nothing.
And almost immediately, the court of public opinion opens its doors and begins its own trial.
As it always does.
Yeah, because when you survive a trauma, society expects you to play the perfect victim. Like an actor hitting their marks in a movie,
You're supposed to cry at the right times, look appropriately disheveled.
Yes, and express your grief in a way that makes the public comfortable. And Joanne Lees didn't do that. If you look at the Reddit threads discussing this case, even decades later, people point out how heavily she was criticized by the media.
They called her emotionless, right, or stoic.
Exactly. And the media narrative shifted very quickly. There were inconsistencies in her initial statements to the police, which, as the sources point out, neurological studies show is actually very common for trauma victims operating under extreme stress.
Your brain is just scrambling to survive.
Right. But the press seized on those inconsistencies. The media comparisons to the Azaria Chamberlain case, You know, the infamous Dingo Baby case from the 1980s where a mother was wrongfully convicted. Those comparisons were immediate and relentless.
The public just grew highly skeptical of Lee's entire story.
And it definitely fueled the fire when she accepted a 50,000-pound payment for a televised interview with Martin Bashir. The public and the media essentially turned her from a surviving victim into a prime suspect.
Which is awful. But while the media was busy analyzing her body language on television, the police were realizing that to solve a crime in a desert the size of Europe, they couldn't just look at the landscape.
They had to look microscopic.
Exactly. Because the physical evidence, while incredibly sparse, told a very specific story.
Right, you had that pool of blood on the road.
Which forensically confirmed Falconio had suffered a massive catastrophic injury. But more importantly for identifying the attacker, the forensic team found an unknown male's DNA on the back of Joanne Lee's T-shirt and on the combi's gear stick.
And this is the part of the source material where the defense really goes on the attack during the trial, because the initial forensic work was done in Darwin by a forensic biologist named Dr. Carmen Eckhoff.
And her lab was not exactly state-of-the-art.
Not at all. According to the Supreme Court transcripts, her lab was literally a converted office space inside a police station. It wasn't even officially accredited by the Australian National Association of Testing Authorities.
The defense leaned heavily into that detail. Dr. Eckhoff herself had to testify that the conditions were, in her words, less than ideal.
I mean, to get the biological samples from the locked freezer to the testing area, they had to be carried in a sealed container down a regular public hallway in the police station.
Which sounds crazy today.
If I am sitting on that jury, I have to be asking some serious questions about that. If the lab conditions are that far from the gold standard, how can you possibly trust that the DNA wasn't just accidentally contaminated by the police?
It's a fair question.
How do you know a detective didn't sneeze on the evidence or accidentally transfer DNA from a completely different case file while walking down that public hallway?
It is a highly valid concern, and it formed the core of the defense's strategy. But the prosecution had a scientific countermeasure.
Oh.
Because the DNA samples recovered from the scene were so minute and degraded by the harsh outback environment, the Darwin lab simply couldn't extract a full profile from them.
So what did they do?
Well, in 2003, they packaged the extracts and sent them across the world to Dr. Jonathan Whitaker at the Weatherby Laboratory in the UK. Dr. Whitaker was pioneering a brand new, highly sensitive technique called low copy number, or LCN, DNA testing.
Oh, this is essentially the precursor to the touch DNA we hear about on every true crime show today, right?
Yeah.
Where investigators only need a handful of skin cells to get a match.
That's the one. LCN was engineered specifically for samples containing minuscule degraded amounts of genetic material.
Okay.
Dr. Whitaker explained in court that to make this work, they utilize an extra preparatory step called microconing.
Microconing?
Yeah. Think of the original sample as being polluted with environmental inhibitors. You've got dirt from the outback, biological degradation, dust from Joanne Lee's T-shirt.
Just a mess of microscopic junk.
Exactly. Microconing essentially acts as a molecular filter, stripping all of those impurities away. Dr. Whitaker likened it to removing water from a petrol tank.
Yeah.
If you don't remove the water, the engine won't run, no matter how much fuel you add.
That makes sense. You have to clean the sample before you can amplify it. But wait, if you are taking a tiny degraded sample of DNA and magnifying it, aren't you also magnifying all the microscopic background noise?
Right.
Like if someone brushed against her shirt 3 days earlier, doesn't that get amplified too? How is that reliable?
The amplification process is exactly where LCN differs from standard tests and is where the scientific debate lived. In a standard DNA test of that era, the genetic material is copied or amplified 28 times through a process called PCR.
Okay, 28 times.
But in LCN, they pushed that amplification to 34 times.
Oh.
Because the copying process is exponential, those 6 extra cycles produce a massive increase in the amount of visible genetic material.
Wow.
That extra amplification allowed the UK lab to find a clear, readable profile on Lee's shirt that matched a man named Bradley John Murdoch.
And the numbers they presented were just insane.
The statistical probability presented in court was staggering. It was 150 quadrillion times more likely to be Murdoch's DNA than a random person's.
150 quadrillion. That is a number so big the human brain can barely comprehend it.
It's astronomical.
But that still doesn't answer the contamination worry from the unaccredited Darwin lab. How did the prosecution prove the DNA didn't get mixed up while being carried down that public hallway before it ever reached the UK?
They proved it through the rigorous use of negative controls.
Okay.
When Dr. Eckhoff initially processed the evidence in that converted office in Darwin, she also processed a completely blank tube, a negative control, using the exact same chemicals, the same procedures, and the same public hallway.
Clever.
That blank tube traveled to the UK alongside the actual evidence. When the UK lab tested the blank tube using that highly sensitive 34-cycle LCN process, it came back completely clean.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. If the Darwin lab was cross-contaminating evidence with background DNA, that blank tube would have shown foreign genetic material. The fact that it didn't was incredibly powerful evidence that the process was secure.
So the blank tube is basically a scientific alibi for the evidence itself. But Murdoch's defense team still didn't give up, though. They pivoted.
Right. The Red Rooster defense.
Yes. They argued that, sure, maybe it is his DNA on her shirt, but it got there completely innocently. They built this narrative that earlier that day, Lees and Falconio had stopped at a Red Rooster restaurant in Alice Springs.
And Murdoch was allegedly there, too.
Yeah, the defense suggested he was also there, buying food for his dog, accidentally bumped into Lees in the crowd, and transferred his touch DNA onto her shirt.
It is a classic legal defense strategy. I mean, if you cannot beat the science, provide an innocent, mundane explanation for how the physical evidence got there.
But their strategy completely falls apart when you look at his actual life. Years later, while Murdoch is sitting in a maximum security prison in Darwin, a magazine reports on his life behind bars. He demands a highly specialized prison diet. He claims he is deathly allergic to chicken.
You're kidding?
No. The prison dietitian literally had to construct a custom menu for him to ensure he was never served poultry. So his own defense team builds a story about him stopping at a fried chicken restaurant, completely ignoring the fact that his own biology makes that incredibly unlikely.
That is wild. It certainly shatters the narrative of a man casually stopping at a chicken shop. This raises an important question about the legal system, though. Does cutting-edge experimental science belong in a courtroom before it's universally adopted?
Because at the time of the trial, LCN was still heavily debated in the scientific community, right? Critics worried it was too sensitive.
Exactly. If the test is too good, you risk convicting an innocent person who just happened to touch the same door handle as the victim.
That's a scary thought.
It is. But the legacy of the Falconio case is that it became a proving ground for the science. Years after Murdoch's trial, a major UK forensic regulator review, led by Professor Brian Caddy, specifically examined the LCN technique pioneered by the Weatherby lab.
And what did they find?
That review concluded that the science was safe, robust, and completely valid for criminal prosecutions. The Murdoch trial helped cement touch DNA as a reliable tool in courtrooms worldwide.
So the DNA successfully places Bradley John Murdoch inside the victim's combi van and puts his blood on Joanne Lees' shirt. But to lock the case down, the prosecution also had to prove he was the man caught on a blurry CCTV camera at a Shell truck stop in Alice Springs hours after the attack.
And that footage showed a man matching Lee's physical description of the attacker, driving a white Toyota four-wheel drive matching the one used in the crime.
But the video was incredibly grainy.
Yeah, it was low-resolution, late-night security footage. You couldn't just play it for the jury and say with absolute certainty, look, that's Bradley John Murdoch.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because it turns into a battle of the experts. The prosecution brings in Dr. Maya Sutisno, an expert in facial and body mapping.
Right.
She analyzes the blurry CCTV footage, compares it to high-quality footage of Murdoch walking around in prison, and testifies that the morphological features match. She says, it's him.
And then the defense brings in their own expert.
Yep. The defense counters with Professor Maciej Henneberg. He looks at the same footage and argues it is practically potato quality. He insists you cannot possibly make valid anatomical claims from pixels that degraded.
It was a fundamental clash of methodologies. Dr. Sutisno broke down the suspect's body into specific components, analyzing posture, dynamic movement, and the general shape of the head and shoulders.
Okay.
But Professor Henneberg argued that without clear, fixed anatomical landmarks, her analysis was just guesswork masquerading as hard science.
I have to side with the skepticism here. I mean, isn't body mapping just a fancy scientific-sounding term for what any of us do when we recognize a friend walking down the street?
Basically, yeah.
You see their silhouette, you recognize their gait, and your brain just puts the pieces together? Why do we need an anatomist to tell a jury what they can literally see with their own eyes on a TV screen?
You've hit on the exact legal tension that the Northern Territory Supreme Court had to resolve during the appeals process. The court had to draw a very fine but absolutely vital line regarding what constitutes expert evidence.
How did they divide it?
They ruled that facial mapping, which involves comparing fixed structures, like the bridge of a nose or the exact distance between the eyes, is an accepted hard science. The bones in your face don't change position.
That makes sense.
But body mapping, which involves comparing posture and movement from blurry video, was rejected as a universally recognized hard science.
Because posture changes? You walk differently if you're tired, if you're wearing heavy boots, or if the camera lens distorts the image. So the court threw her evidence out completely.
Not entirely. The court established the concept of an ad hoc expert.
I've seen that term in the sources. What does an ad hoc expert actually mean in practice?
It means that while Dr. Sutisno couldn't take the witness stand and declare science mathematically proves this is Bradley Murdoch's body, she was recognized as someone who had spent hundreds of hours studying that specific piece of CCTV footage.
So she's basically an expert on that one video.
Exactly. She knew every artifact, every pixel, and every shadow of that video better than any juror ever could. Because of that intensive, specific study, the court allowed her to act as a guide.
Oh, I see.
She could point out similarities and differences to the jury, drawing their attention to details they might miss on a casual viewing, even though she couldn't offer a definitive, scientifically binding conclusion on his identity.
It's essentially like having a highly trained art critic walk you through a gallery. They can point out the specific brushstrokes and the use of light to explain why a painting looks like a Picasso, even if they don't have the legal authority to authenticate it.
That's a great analogy.
Ultimately, that combination of evidence, the ad hoc expert mapping his movements, the incredibly resilient 34-cycle LCN DNA, and Joanne Lee's harrowing testimony was enough. In December 2005, Bradley John Murdoch was convicted of murder.
He was sentenced to life in prison with a 28-year non-parole period.
His appeals were exhausted, and he was locked away.
The conviction was a massive victory for the prosecution and for forensic science. But it left the most agonizing question of the entire ordeal unanswered. Where is Peter Falconio?
And that brings us to the most recent and arguably most frustrating development in our sources. According to Northern Territory Police statements, on July 15, 2025, which was just one day after the 24th anniversary of the crime, Bradley John Murdoch died in palliative care at Alice Springs Hospital.
He was 67 years old, suffering from throat cancer.
And he took the location of Peter Falconio's body to his grave.
He maintained his innocence until his dying breath. He never offered a confession, and he never offered a map.
So, what does this all mean? The killer is dead. The victim is still missing in an environment that destroys physical evidence. Is the case just permanently closed? Do we just accept that the Outback keeps it secret?
From a law enforcement perspective, the investigation remains very much active. The Northern Territory Police issued a statement immediately following his death, making it clear the search is not over.
Really? Even now?
Yes. And the reason for that optimism is that the science of the search has evolved dramatically since 2001. This brings us to the fascinating work of Dr. Mark Harrison.
The sources refer to him as the man the FBI calls Dr. Search.
Dr. Harrison is a former UK National Police Search Advisor and a world-leading consultant in what is clinically known as no-body homicides. He holds a PhD in the subject. In 2006, the Northern Territory Police brought him in to completely overhaul the search strategy for Falconio's remains.
And his approach is entirely different from just putting a grid over a map and walking the desert, right? He uses a discipline called geoforensics.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, geoforensics is the incredibly complex intersection where behavioral psychology meets geology.
Okay, break that down for me.
Well, Dr. Harrison explains that the general public assumes that because the Outback is vast, killers will automatically use that vastness to hide bodies deeply and complexly. We picture someone driving hundreds of miles into the dunes to bury a secret.
That's definitely what I would picture.
But behavioral science shows that body disposal by a killer doesn't actually work that way, particularly in an unplanned homicide.
And the working theory from the police is that Murdoch's primary goal that night wasn't murder. They believe he was running a significant amount of cannabis across the territory. The murder was a violent, panicked reaction to a situation on the highway that suddenly got out of hand.
That behavioral context is crucial. Harrison's profiling categorizes Murdoch's actions that night as a functionary disposal.
Functionary disposal, meaning what?
Murdoch was panicked. He was highly likely under the influence of amphetamines. He simply needed to get rid of the body to facilitate his immediate escape. He didn't hide Peter Falconio with the intention of ever returning to visit a grave or move the remains later.
He just needed the problem gone so he could get off the road.
Knowing that completely changes the search parameters. It means Murdoch wouldn't have risked driving his vehicle hundreds of kilometers off-road into the deep, dark desert where he might get bogged down or lost.
No, that makes total sense.
He would have utilized the existing topography very close to his escape route. Dr. Harrison's team combined this psychological profile with hard geological data, tracking daytime and nighttime topographies along the Stewart Highway.
Looking for what, exactly?
They looked for features a panicked driver would spot in the headlights: culverts, washaways, and natural depressions near the road.
And the result of applying that geoforensic mapping is incredible. In 2007 and 2008, Dr. Harrison handed the Northern Territory Police 2 massive reports. He had taken the entire vast expanse of the outback and narrowed it down to 5 highly probable disposal sites.
5 specific locations out of millions of square miles. And Dr. Harrison firmly insists that even now, decades later, the chances of finding Falconio's remains at one of those 5 sites are reasonably high.
Even after all this time.
Yeah, because the technology available to search teams today, advanced ground-penetrating radar, drone-mounted topographical mapping, is leaps and bounds ahead of what existed during the initial searches in 2001.
The police certainly haven't given up, and the public still has a massive role to play. If you are listening to this and you know anything about the geography of those routes, the authorities are still offering a $500,000 reward, $500,000 for information leading to the discovery of Peter Falconio.
It's a huge incentive.
It is. The killer might be dead, but the determination to bring a victim home is very much alive. Science mapped the microscopic touch DNA on a T-shirt to prove a killer was there. The legal system mapped the blurry movements of a man on a CCTV screen to track his escape. Now geoforensics just needs to finish mapping the Earth to find what he left behind.
It is a profound intersection of tragedy, survival, and sheer human determination. You have a case with no body, a heavily scrutinized survivor facing global media pressure, and unaccredited rural labs. Yet the conviction was secured by pushing the absolute frontiers of forensic science.
It really is amazing what they accomplished.
And, in a modern world where we feel completely tracked by our digital footprints, our cell phone pings, and our biological data, the Falconio case serves as a haunting reminder of the physical world's immense scale.
Yeah.
A human being can still simply vanish into the landscape, leaving science and human determination locked in a decades-long battle against the silent, unyielding Earth.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. Keep questioning the information around you. Keep looking closely at the details. And remember, sometimes the loudest answers are found in the quietest, darkest places.